The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned grounds of Six Flags New Orleans. Once it had been a place of joy and laughter, where families gathered to escape reality and indulge in thrills. Now, it lay in ruins, a ghost of its former self, ravaged by Hurricane Katrina and left to decay in silence. But silence is a relative term. As the last rays of light faded, a different kind of energy began to stir in the park, one that had been dormant for years. It is said that places where intense emotions have been felt retain a certain resonance. And the empty, twisted metal remains of Six Flags held a resonance that whispered of fear, desperation, and a lingering presence that refused to be forgotten. A group of thrill-seekers drawn by the allure of the forbidden and the tales of the haunted park dared to venture beyond the rusted gates. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of mildew and brackish water from the surrounding swamps. They laughed nervously, their voices echoing in the vast emptiness. They had come armed with flashlights and cameras, eager to capture a glimpse of the supernatural. They entered the park, their footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. The skeletal remains of roller coasters loomed overhead, their tracks twisted and contorted like the spine of some great beast. As they walked deeper into the park, the laughter began to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. Even the insects and frogs, so loud in the swamp, seemed muted here. They reached the center of the park, where the Ferris wheel stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky. Its seats hung lifeless, swaying gently in the breeze. One of the group members, a young woman named Lisa, suggested they split up to cover more ground. Reluctantly, the others agreed, fanning out in different directions, their flashlights bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps. Lisa found herself drawn to the bumper car pavilion. The roof had partially collapsed, allowing moonlight to filter through, casting eerie patterns on the cracked concrete floor. The cars, once brightly painted, were now rusted and peeling, their skeletal frames jutting out like broken bones. As she stepped inside, a chill ran down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. She heard it then, a faint, distant laughter. It was the laughter of a child, high-pitched and joyful, yet there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She swung her flashlight around, but there was no one there. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the pavilion back into silence. Lisa felt a prickle of fear, but she forced herself to move forward. She had always been the brave one, the one who scoffed at ghost stories and horror movies. But now, in this place, she wasn't so sure. Suddenly, one of the bumper cars moved. It was subtle at first, a slight rocking as if pushed by an unseen hand. Then it began to slide across the floor, slowly at first, then gaining speed. Lisa's flashlight flickered and she stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The car crashed into another with a deafening bang, sending a shower of rust and debris into the air. The laughter returned, louder and more manic, filling the pavilion with its chilling sound. Lisa turned and ran, her heart pounding, her flashlight beam jerking wildly in front of her. Meanwhile, on the other side of the park, another member of the group, Mark, had found his way to the old wooden roller coaster, Mega Zeph. Its towering structure was rotting, the wood splintering and creaking with every gust of wind. He approached cautiously, feeling the boards shift under his weight as he climbed the steps to the loading platform. He was about to turn back when he heard a sound, a low, rhythmic creaking like the sound of a swing moving back and forth. He turned his flashlight towards the sound and froze. One of the roller coaster cars, long abandoned, was moving along the track. It climbed the first hill slowly, methodically, as if pulled by invisible hands. Mark's mouth went dry as he watched the car reach the top of the hill and pause. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a squeal of rusted metal, the car began to descend, picking up speed as it hurtled down the track. Mark's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw something in the car. Shadowy figures, their faces pale and contorted in silent screams. He backed away, tripping over a loose board, his flashlight skittering across the platform and spinning into the darkness below. The roller coaster car flew past, and Mark felt a rush of cold air, colder than anything he'd ever felt, like the breath of death itself. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not stopping until he was back in the main plaza, gasping for breath. The group reconvened by the Ferris wheel, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. They exchanged stories in hushed voices, each more terrified than the last. Something was in this park, something that didn't want them there. Suddenly, the Ferris wheel creaked to life. The ancient gears groaned, and the wheel began to turn slowly, its seat swaying as it picked up speed. The group stared in disbelief. There was no power, no reason for the wheel to be moving. And yet, it was. Then they saw it. A figure standing in one of the seats. A child, no more than 7 or 8 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, staring down at them with hollow eyes. The child's mouth opened, and the same eerie laughter that Lisa had heard filled the air, echoing around them, growing louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. Panic set in. The group turned and fled towards the entrance, their screams joining the cacophony. The gates loomed ahead, but they seemed to stretch farther and farther away with every step. The ground shifted beneath their feet, and they stumbled, falling into the mud and debris. As they scrambled to their feet, the laughter stopped. They looked back and saw the park in its entirety bathed in an unnatural, ghostly light. Figures moved among the ruins, children, adults, all with the same hollow eyes, their faces twisted in eternal fear and pain. With a final burst of adrenaline, the group reached the gates and pushed through, collapsing onto the dirt road outside. They looked back one last time and saw the figures watching them from the shadows, their expressions unreadable, their presence a silent warning. The gates creaked shut behind them, and the park fell silent once more. The group didn't stop running until they were miles away, but the memory of what they had seen, the sounds they had heard, would haunt them forever. Six Flags New Orleans was not just abandoned, it was claimed, a resting place for souls who would never find peace. And as the group disappeared into the night, a soft wind blew through the park, carrying with it the faintest echo of a child's laughter, lost among the twisted metal and shattered dreams. Once upon a time, nestled in the quiet hills of Waterbury, Connecticut, there stood an eerie, abandoned theme park known as Holy Land USA. Once a beacon of faith and devotion, this peculiar place now lay in ruin, overtaken by nature and the chilling whispers of the past. The gates of Holy Land USA, rusted and bent, creaked open like a mouth welcoming you into a nightmare. It was on a moonless night that a group of curious teenagers decided to explore the dilapidated grounds, driven by stories of ghostly apparitions and mysterious disappearances. The air was thick with fog as they climbed over the crumbling walls, their flashlights casting long shadows across statues of saints, whose cracked faces seemed to watch them with empty eyes. Every step they took seemed to echo as if the park itself was alive, waiting. The leader of the group, a boy named Jake, had heard the stories. They spoke of a nun who once lived nearby, who was devoted to the park. She would visit daily, her prayers echoing through the empty buildings long after the visitors had stopped coming. Some say she died there alone, her spirit forever bound to the place she loved so dearly. As Jake led his friends deeper into the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the centerpiece of the park, a towering cross that loomed over everything like a grim sentinel. Beneath it, a small chapel stood, its doors slightly ajar. "Let's go inside," Jake suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them. Inside, the chapel was cold, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Broken pews lined the aisle, leading up to an altar that was shrouded in darkness. As they moved closer, one of the girls, Emma, thought she saw something moving in the shadows. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake turned his flashlight towards the altar, but there was nothing there. Just shadows dancing on the walls, or so he thought. They pressed on, their footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, the chapel door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. The group's flashlights flickered, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the back of the chapel, cloaked in darkness. It was the shape of a woman, her head bowed, hands clasped in prayer. But before he could say anything, the figure vanished, leaving only the suffocating darkness and the sound of their own breathing. Emma screamed, her voice slicing through the silence like a knife. "Let me out! Let me out!" She pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The other boys tried to help, but the door seemed sealed by an unseen force. Suddenly, the room grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly they could see their breath. Then they heard it. A soft, sorrowful whisper, like a prayer from another time. "Sanctus. Sanctus." Jake spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, filling the chapel with a sound like wind through dead leaves. The air grew thick with a heavy, oppressive presence. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw her. The nun. She was standing by the altar, her face obscured by a dark veil. Her body seemed to float above the ground, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. He felt a chill run down his spine as the nun's head slowly turned towards them. Her eyes, dark and hollow, bore into his soul. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just a silent scream of anguish. The group was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Jake tried to speak, to tell them to run, but his voice was caught in his throat. Then, as quickly as she appeared, the nun vanished, leaving only the cold, empty darkness behind. The door suddenly burst open, and they all stumbled out, gasping for air, their hearts racing. They ran, never looking back, as the sound of the chapel door slowly creaked shut behind them. They didn't stop until they were out of the park, panting and trembling, their faces pale with fear. As they reached the safety of the street, Jake turned to look back at Holy Land USA. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the gates, watching them. But when he blinked, it was gone. The group vowed never to return, but the memory of that night would haunt them forever. And the park? It remained as it always had, a place of mystery and dread, where the past and present seemed to collide in a terrifying dance of shadows and whispers. Some say that on a quiet night, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint echo of prayers and the soft whisper of a nun who never left. In the depths of the Ozark Mountains lies Dogpatch USA, a once thriving amusement park now left to decay, swallowed by nature and forgotten by time. The park, built in the 1960s, was meant to be a slice of rustic paradise, inspired by the fictional town of Dogpatch from the comic strip Lil Abner. For years, families flocked to this remote corner of Arkansas to experience its quirky charm. But beneath the laughter and joy, something dark simmered, a shadow lurking, waiting for its time to emerge. When the park closed in the early 1990s, locals began to tell stories of strange occurrences. Visitors who dared to wander the abandoned grounds spoke of eerie sounds, like distant laughter, or the faint strains of carnival music that vanished as quickly as they came. The once vibrant park had become a ghostly reminder of its past, a place where time seemed to stand still, and the air grew thick with an inexplicable chill. But the most terrifying tale of all came from a group of teenagers who ventured into Dogpatch one cold autumn night. They were thrill seekers, eager to test their courage against the whispered legends of hauntings. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they entered the park, stepping over cracked pathways and past rotting wooden structures that creaked in the wind. As they walked, they joked and laughed, trying to dispel the unease that gnawed at the edges of their minds. Their first stop was the old mill, a crumbling structure that once housed a water-powered ride. As they shone their flashlights inside, the beams cut through the dust-filled air, revealing broken machinery and stagnant water that reeked of mildew. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed from within the mill, as if something heavy had fallen. The teenagers jumped, their laughter faltering into nervous giggles. "Just a raccoon," one of them said, trying to sound confident. But the others weren't so sure. They pressed on, making their way to the Ferris wheel, now rusted and overtaken by vines. Its skeletal frame loomed against the darkening sky, a silent sentinel watching over the deserted park. One of the teens, a girl named Lisa, dared to climb into one of the creaking carriages. As she settled in, the wheel groaned to life. The other teens froze, their flashlights flickering erratically. There was no electricity in the park, no power to move the wheel, yet it began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. Lisa's screams pierced the night as the Ferris wheel spun wildly, the other teens shouting in panic, scrambling to help her. But just as abruptly as it started, the wheel stopped. Lisa sat there, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "It wasn't me," she whispered as her friends pulled her out. Something was pushing it, something cold and strong. They decided to leave, the thrill of adventure replaced by a creeping dread. But as they retraced their steps, they realized the path they had taken was no longer there. The park had changed, its layout shifting like a living maze. Trees seemed to close in around them, and the air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim glow of their flashlights. Panic set in as they wandered aimlessly, every turn leading them deeper into the darkness. Then, from somewhere behind them, they heard it, a soft, mournful singing, like a lullaby carried on the wind. They turned, shining their lights toward the sound, but saw nothing. "We need to stick together," one of them said, his voice trembling. But the singing grew louder, more insistent, drawing them toward the remains of a ride called the Haunted Castle. The entrance gaped like a mouth in the shadows, a sign hanging crookedly above it, swaying in the breeze. Against their better judgment, they stepped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the smell of damp rot filled their nostrils. As they moved deeper into the ride, their flashlights revealed faded murals of ghosts and ghouls on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow the group. Suddenly, a door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into complete darkness. The singing stopped, replaced by a soft whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand, words that clawed at their sanity. Lisa clutched her head, her face contorted in pain. "Make it stop," she cried, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. And then, as if obeying her command, the whispers ceased, replaced by a single, chilling voice. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words dripping with malice. "This place is ours now." The flashlights flickered again, and in that brief moment of light, they saw them, figures standing just beyond the edge of darkness. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The figures moved closer, their shapes indistinct, shifting like smoke. The teens turned and ran, stumbling over debris, their breaths ragged with fear. They burst out of the haunted castle and into the open air, but the park was different now. The attraction seemed to loom larger, more menacing, and the path twisted in impossible directions. The air buzzed with an unseen energy, a force that pulled at them, slowing their escape. As they neared the entrance, a final barrier to freedom, they saw them again. Those figures, standing just beyond the gates, their eyes glowing in the darkness. But this time, there was no escape. The gate slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking them inside. Trapped, the teens huddled together, their eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the figures. But the park had gone silent, the only sound their own frantic breathing. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning in that place. Then, just as they were beginning to lose hope, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. The park seemed to sigh, releasing them from its grip. The gate creaked open, and without a second thought, they fled, not daring to look back. They never spoke of what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone. But they knew. Dogpatch USA wasn't just abandoned, it was claimed. By what? They couldn't say. But those who enter that place should beware. Some things are meant to stay forgotten, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The park still stands today, its ruins hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next group of thrill seekers, the next brave souls who think they can face the darkness and emerge unscathed. But remember this: Dogpatch USA has a way of keeping what it wants, and if you go there, you might just find yourself becoming part of its story, trapped in a place where the past never truly dies, and the shadows have their own life.